I think if I'm not mistaken, it was Tertullian who also said something to the effect of like, look, in talking about the this unraveling and the line of succession, basically, you can't know truth unless you know like falsehoods, right?
Right, right.
Or you can't know what's false backwards. You can't know what's false unless you first know what's true. And so
I
it's
see what you're
so
saying. Yeah.
important to know, like, well, what was passed down and what was true, and how do you know what's true so you can actually identify heresy? Otherwise, you can't. I mean, then you have the whole Arian, the Arian controversy, right? And all the different heresies that have mapped themselves out over the years. How did you get through heresies and controversies like that? You had to have something that ultimately you can kind of get back to. But you brought up something else too, Keith, that I want to dive into that I think is really interesting. St. John Henry Newman, obviously a Anglican convert to Catholicism, now saint. He coined this kind of idea of the development of doctrine, right? Yeah. And you mentioned something about how the United States, which I thought was a great analogy, looked one way hundreds of years ago, and it looks different now. Still the same United States, but it might just look a little bit different. Still the same kind of tenets. In what ways has the Catholic Church developed from the early church into where it is today? And should that pose a problem to Christians? Why or why not?
Well, okay, so it's developed in some ways that are super practical. Like, for example, it's legal to be a Christian now. When the early church started, it wasn't legal to be a Christian. So that lends itself to a lot of practical things, like you can now have your own buildings that are above ground. You can now publicly say, hey, we are the church without fear of being attacked. So, the doctrine of the Catholic Church has become more defined. And here's what I mean by that. We talked about this whole idea of things are defined when they're attacked. So when, everyone has this idea of what the church teaches, maybe not completely in every aspect of every area. Okay. Cause when the early Christians first began, we didn't have the New Testament canonized. We didn't have volumes of theology written by Thomas Aquinas. We didn't have all these things. So for someone to learn about the Christian faith, it was so new that it was, people were still understanding it and learning what it was. And all of those ideas began to grow. And then, of course, when the New Testament is canonized, now we have this scripture that we can look to and interpret and unpack. And that has led to all sorts of understandings. So I think that over the course of time, just as, your relationship with your wife develops and grows based on the amount of time you spend with her, it's going to look different. And so I think that the church has grown in those ways because it's had the benefit of more believers to help it unpack and understand the foundational teachings. And it's had 2,000 years of existence to help it become, more of a organization that can serve the entire world. I mean, when the church first began, what did Jesus say? You'll be my witnesses from Jerusalem, Samaria, Judea, and to the ends of the earth. Well, just logistically speaking, a ministry that's going to minister to one small area looks different than one that ministers to the entire world for 2,000 years. Yeah. And so I think those are some of the reasons why it's developed and grown, because it's just been around for 2,000 years.
Yeah. And I think understandings of different things deepen too, and
they do.
So it's a natural progression. Like you just look at, like, for example, something that even non-Catholics take a little bit for granted, right? The concept of the Trinity. It's not, I don't know how many people are fully aware that it was a hotly debated topic for hundreds of years. It didn't come to kind of its formal conclusion. Now everybody can look back and be like, oh, I see the seeds of it in scripture now, but put yourself in the first century Jewish context who's just now learning about the Christian faith. Would you have necessarily seen the same thing? Well, the earliest kind of versions of that kind of point to something probably a little bit alternative to that, which enter heresy, right? Enter Arianism, right? How do we understand what Jesus really was, So I think you're right. Until something is contested, the church never necessarily felt the need to formally define it.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for checking out this clip from the Practical Theism podcast. If you enjoyed this clip and you want to check out the full episode, you can do so by finding it on our YouTube channel. Definitely consider subscribing and ringing that little bell so you can continue to get updates and notifications when we release new episodes and new clips just like this one. I hope to see you soon.